Hi, I'm Bill Mosley, and welcome to the first episode of Building a Game with Pygame in Python. We'll be working on a game I will call Asteroid Hunter, which is going to end up looking like a spin-off of the classic game Asteroids. And it's very common, but it's interesting because it allows us to explore a lot of different concepts from player movement to keeping score to leveling and that sort of thing. So it's a great primer for beginners who want to learn how to make games. To be successful in this and to really understand what's going on, you should have some basic understanding of Python and even some basic understanding of Pygame and what it is, or at least how games work, would be useful, although it's not necessary. If you want to learn more about Python and want to bring yourself up to speed on the basics, you can check out some of my other videos on my YouTube channel. As these are released, if you want to get updates when there's new episodes available, please subscribe to my channel. Let's get started. So first, let me show you what we're going to end up with today. And it may not seem very impressive, but it is the most basic thing you can do with Pygame. And so it's useful to us because it'll get us started with some of the basic ideas of Pygame and some of the basic constructs. So this is it. It's a window with a single spaceship flying on a plain black background. And right now, that's pretty much all it does. And what you can't see is that this is a active updating video game. But since we haven't created any players controls or movement or scoring or enemies or anything else, it looks like just a static picture. But in fact, this is refreshing at about 60 frames per second. So 60 times per second, this image is being updated, although it's being updated with the same exact image, so we can't really see what's going on. So let's get into the code, and as we get started, I'll explain each part of this and what's going on and what we're going to do with it. So I'm going to be working in a program called PyCharm, and PyCharm is a really great program. There is a community version, which is free at the moment, and it's also free if you are a student with an educational institution email address or a professor or teacher with an educational institution email address. And the company that creates PyCharm is very, very generous with educational licensing. And so this is my preferred development environment, although you can use other editors for sure. So let's get started with our first line of code. And the first thing we need to do is we need to import the Pygame module. And this just simply allows us access to all of the features of Pygame. And then we're going to actually do something that is a little bit redundant here. And we're going to say from pygame.locals import, that would be from Pygame locals import. And we are going to import just one thing right now, but I'm going to do a multi-line command here and leave myself some room for some other stuff. And all I'm going to do is import this one constant. You can see it's a constant because it is all uppercase, but this allows us to easily detect when the game window is closed. And that's useful to us because it will use that later on to stop the program running when the game window is closed. The next thing we want to do is we want to initialize Pygame. So we're going to tell the Pygame module to start working. Okay, so let's go ahead and use our comments here to make sure we know what we're doing. And pygame.init, it's short for initialize, and it's a function or a method, so we do include the empty parentheses there. Make sure that you're careful about your punctuation as you go through these because punctuation and case sensitivity do matter. Next, let's define the constants for the game. And for now, it's going to be just a couple. The first one is screen width, And we'll set the width of the screen to 800. That's 800 pixels wide. Screen height is going to be 600. So we'll end up with a rectangular sized screen. And we're defining constants. These are similar to variables, and in fact, they are variables, but the act of declaring them in all uppercase letters is a reminder to us and anybody else who might read our code that these are variables that don't change, which is why we call them constants. CONSTANTS. So next thing we want to do is we want to set up the display. So let's set up the display. It's good to leave comments for yourself so that you know what you're doing later. So I'm going to define a screen as pygame.display, and we're going to use the set mode method here to set the screen width and screen height. Now notice I'm using two sets of parentheses here because this takes a single argument in the form of a tuple, which is basically a way to say it takes a short list as the one argument, and that short list has the width and height of the screen. So this is where I'm going to start using my screen width and my screen height with a comma in between. And now I've set the display or the window size to those coordinates. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my caption, which is the title bar at the top of the window. So pygame.display.set caption, and I'm going to give that a string called asteroid hunter. Sounds great, and eventually the game is going to be great, but we've got a ways to go still. Now, if I were to run this right now, nothing would happen because I haven't told the game to actually run. So I can just go ahead and run it and show you. Absolutely nothing happens. It exits with no errors, but it doesn't really do anything visible. And that's because I haven't told it to do anything yet. So let's start by importing the graphic of the ship, and you can use the ship graphic that I created if you want. It's pretty simple, and you can download that from my website at bmosley.com, or you can create your own quite easily. There are a number of different pixel editors online. Notice that my graphic image here is 20 pixels wide by 28 pixels tall. You want to make sure that the size of the image is just big enough to contain the image, because that makes sure that the hitbox of this image isn't much larger than that image. You also want to keep in mind that if your screen is 800 pixels wide by 600 tall, that you don't want a huge image. You don't want like 100 by 100 image, because it's going to take up so much of your screen that it won't have room to fly around. So you want to keep track, keep an idea of how big you want your ship to be in the window itself. So you can download that, and I put all of my images, you can see, are in a folder over here called images, and we'll use these throughout this tutorial, or throughout these set of tutorials. But for now, I'm going to use this one called ahship.png. And so what I have to do is tell Pygame to load that image into an image object, which will also become what's called a surface. So load player image. That's a comment. So now we're going to say player static equals pygame.image.load, and I'm going to look in my images directory for the ahship.png, and at the end of that I'm going to add this command called convert alpha, and what that says is that this image contains transparency. So to look at the image, the pixels here that are lighter gray and everything inside of that is the visible part of the image, and the rest of that image square is actually transparent. And so I need to let Pygame know that there's some transparency there, and to use that when it displays that by adding the convert underscore alpha method. So make sure you include that, and make sure you're including the periods and all of the punctuation in the right place. So far, so good. We've kind of set up the screen and we've loaded the player image. Now we're going to create what's called the player class. And the player class at this point is going to be very, very simple. All it's going to do is create the player, and it's going to show the player where to start on the screen. So I start at every class that I create. I use the class declaration, and I'm going to call it player. And I'm basing that on the pygame.sprite.sprite class. That's the super class that I'm using. If you don't understand what a super class is, that's fine. Just keep following along. It'll make a little more sense as we get into it. So now I'm going to define what's called the initialization method for this class. And I'm going to, as part of that, I need to initialize the super class. So I'm going to call super initialization, and that's all. Now, don't worry too much about what these mean, but it has to do with something called object-oriented programming. Again, if you're interested in learning more about object-oriented programming, superclasses, inheritance, all of that stuff, if you want to learn the details, I have tutorials available via my website and also the YouTube channel, so you can check those out. But essentially, these are just things that we have to include here so that when this sprite is created, when this player is created, it's going to do all these things. So we're going to do that. We're going to set a variable called self.angle to 0, which it means that ship is going to be pointed up. We're going to create what's called a surface, and we're going to set the surface of that to the player static image that we loaded. Okay, so now the surface is the visible part of the sprite, and the rectangle, which is what we're going to create next, is the part of the sprite that you can't see. It controls the player movement, it controls collisions with other objects on the screen. Lots of things are controlled by the rectangle. So we're going to self surface. We are going to use the get rectangle method of the surface, which is this, to create the rectangle size from that object, or the rectangle of that object. So basically what we're saying here is we're going to use the player image to create the rectangle, which is the borders and the size and the positioning of that object. Again, if it doesn't totally make sense to you, just hang in there. As we go through this, it will make more sense. Sometimes the best way to do things is the best way to learn things is by doing them. So again, I am going to set the center of that rectangle. So I'm positioning the ship in the middle of the screen. Well, what's the easiest way to figure out the middle of the screen? Now I could just say, well, the middle of the width is 400 pixels and the middle of the height is 300 pixels. And I could say 400 times by 300. But there's actually a better way to do that, because if I decide to change the screen size, then I would have to change these as well. And if I just base it directly on the screen size, it makes a little bit more sense. So I'm going to say screen width, and I'm going to say 4 divided by 2, which means it's going to divide the screen width by 2 and drop the remainder. And I'm going to say screen height, 4 divided by 2. So now, no matter what I change these to, the ship's always going to appear in the middle of the screen, which is nice and convenient for me. And that's it. That's the whole player sprite, the whole player class for now. We're going to add a whole lot more to that later, but since it doesn't move, it doesn't shoot, it doesn't really do anything except sit there and look good, we're done with that for now. So now what we need to do, now that we have the player class created, is we need to create an instance of that class. and I'm going to call it player, all lowercase. Notice that the class is uppercase player. Lowercase player is the instance of that class. And I can do that because there's only one player in the game right now. You could, in fact, have two players, but right now we're going to do one player, and we're going to base it on the player class. Okay, and that's the instance. So now if I want to refer to the instance of that player class, I'm going to use the lowercase version of it. Create a player. Okay, so now I want to create what's called a sprite group, and I'm going to call it all sprites. Well, now, right now there's only one sprite, but we're going to set up this group so that we can use it later. And the way we set up a sprite group is by saying pygame.sprite.group. Okay, and it looks just like that. Now we're going to add the player sprite to that group. So we're going to say all sprites dot add, and we're going to tell it we're adding the player. So now we have a group of sprites, and it's a very lonely group because it just has that one sprite, the player sprite. Now we're going to do something called setting up the main loop or the game loop. So we're going to set a variable called running, and we're going to set that to true. And what that means is while the game is running, this will be set to true. And anytime we want the game to stop, we set it to false, and then that stops everything from running. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to create something called a clock, which controls the speed of our game. And we're going to say pygame dot time and dot clock. There we go. Got it. So we're going to set up our game loop variables, game loop variables, and start the game loop. Okay, so let's start the game loop here. So while we do that, when we do that, we are going to say while running. And this is basically the same as saying while running equals true, but it's a little bit redundant because if we say this and running is true, then it's the same as saying while true. If running is false, then of course it would be while false, but that doesn't make sense because the loop wouldn't go at all then. So we're going to say while running, which is a convenient way for us to remember that the game is in fact running. And right now, the first thing we need to do in each loop is check and see if the window has been closed, and if it has, then we quit the game. So this is where we're going to use this little quit, this constant that we imported from the Pygame locals here. So let's say first thing we need to do is for event in pygame.event.get. Okay, basically event get will send us back a list of things that happen in the game. They could be player collisions, they could be keyboard presses, they could be game controller movements, they could be all kinds of things. And one of the events, the main event that we're looking for today is the quit event. So if I say if event type equals quit, then we change the running variable to false, and the game will stop. Okay, so that's checking to see if the window has been closed. We will add other events to this as we go through the tutorials, but for now, we're just checking to see if that window is closed. The next thing we need to do each time the game loop runs is fill the screen with black. Screen, fill, and I'm going to use the RGB values, which is 0, 0, 0. That's how we say black in red, green, and blue. So red is set to 0, green is set to 0, and blue is set to 0. And then the next thing we do after that is we got to draw the sprite on the screen. And we're going to use our all sprites group to do that. So we're going to say for entity in all sprites. And then we're going to use a command called screen.blit. Blit means to draw the sprite or the object on the screen. So now we're going to say entity surface and entity dot rect. And what those are referring to is this, which is the image, and this, which is the location. Okay, so we have the surface and the rectangle. We have the surface and the rectangle. So this says draw this image at this location on the screen. So we're going to draw the sprite on the screen. And the next thing we're going to do is a little thing called pygame.display.flip. And all that says is the stuff that we've drawn onto the screen, let's flip it so that it's now visible. And one thing you need to understand about Pygame is that it works kind of like the flip books that you used to make maybe when you were a little bit younger, or maybe you still make them today, that's fine too, where you take a pad of paper and you draw a slightly different image on each page. And as you flip through it, it looks like the images are moving. And the difference with Pygame and a flip book is that with Pygame, we're actually showing one page and drawing the next page. And then when we flip that, we automatically show the next page. The next thing we need to do is pause for a moment. And what this says is, let's make sure that we slow the game down so that we are only showing 60 frames in each second. So this loop is actually going to run 60 times per second. And the way clock tick works is it basically says, let's make sure that we're waiting here at this line of code long enough so that this loop doesn't go through 1,000 times a second, which would make your game impossible to play because everything would happen so quickly. So this actually slows it down because our computers are fast enough now that the game loop would run so fast we couldn't even play the game. So we're going to have that clock tick in there. If you want the game to run faster, you can increase this number. And if you want the game to run slower, you can decrease this number. Of course, you won't be able to tell anything that changes when you make this number different, at least not right now, because every frame is going to look exactly the same. The sprite just doesn't move. So the last thing we need to do is type pygame.quit. Now notice that this is not inside the game loop. So everything that's inside the game loop is indented. Pygame is part of the main branch of code, and this line is not executed until the game loop stops. So if we close the window, which is what this means, it turns running to false, running turns from true to false, the game loop exits, and then we use pygame quit to undo what we did with pygame initialize. So now if I run this code, it should show me that little window with my ship in there. And of course, I'm pressing all my keys here and it's not doing a thing, but it is refreshing at 60 frames per second. You just can't see any different. So that is part one. I know it's not a very fun game yet, but you've learned a lot of the really basic things about setting up a Pygame. In part two, we'll start messing around with making that ship do things when we press buttons.